Hi everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's Stuart Hillard here, and how have you been? Oh, I've been well, thanks for asking. Now in today's video, I'm going to show you how to make a fabric basket. I've made so many of these. They're so useful for carrying things like, you know, little projects around, knitting, crochet. They're great for storing fat quarters. They're also really useful for just sort of, you know, quick tidy ups, and they'll go on a shelf really nicely. The biggest benefit, of course, of them is that they are really quick and easy to make, and you can use up your fabric scraps. Now, actually, on this version, what I've done is I've sewn bits of fabric together, rectangles and squares, sewn them all together to make the outer. So you could even use orphan quilt blocks, or if you've got real little scraps, just sew them all together and make a larger piece of fabric. But for today's tutorial, I'm going to keep it nice and simple and just use whole pieces of fabric. So let me show you what you're going to need. Of course, you're going to need some lovely fabric, and you'll need two different fabrics for my simple version. You're going to need one fabric for the outer basket, and then you're going to need a second fabric for the lining. And for this example, I'm going to make a slightly smaller basket, and I'm using 12-inch squares. I've done these as small as 6 inches square, make little baskets, and they're really cute for using, you know, maybe you could put things like hair bubbles or earrings or, you know, makeup, things like that in. But so 12-inch squares, so one for the outer, one for the lining. You're also going to need a piece of Bosal in our form, which is like a thin, really easy to sew foam. This one is single-sided fusible. So one side has a fusible on it, the other side does not. You can get two-sided fusible, and you can also get completely non-fusible as well. Any of those will work. So that's that. And then for the handles, you've got these kind of useful carry handles either side of your basket. You're going to need some rectangles of fabric. Now for this version, I've cut my strips of fabric 3 inches wide by 9.5 inches long. If you're making a much larger basket, you might want those handles a little bit longer, maybe even very slightly wider. And if you were doing a little basket, again, proportionately, just make those rectangles smaller. But it's not a difficult job just to sort of experiment and tweak the sizes. So you'll need to cut out 2 pieces of in-our form to that size, 3 inches by 9.5 inches, 2 of those. And then you're going to need 2 rectangles of fabric for the outer handles and 2 pieces of fabric for the lining as well. So in total then we've got 6 pieces of fabric cut out and 3 pieces of in-our form. Okay, so let's get straight on and make the outer basket. So I'm going to grab my outer fabric, that's my big, gorgeous kind of roses, and I'm going to put that onto the fusible side of my in-our form and take it over to my ironing surface, and then just using minimal heat, just attach that. If you're using the non-fusible in-our form, then you could use something like 505 spray here, or you could even just pin it. And then, of course, if you wanted to, you could add a bit of quilting. If you're using the two-sided fusible, by the way, it's a really good idea just to put something like a piece of baking parchment down onto your ironing surface first, just to make sure that if any heat does manage to get all the way through and activate any of the glue on the other side, it's not going to stick to your ironing board, and it'll just peel off baking parchment. Okay, so that square is now attached to my piece of Bosal, and while I'm in the mood for ironing, I might as well attach my 2 outer handle pieces of fabric to the corresponding pieces of Bosal as well. And when I talk about minimal heat, really what I'm talking about there is use the lowest setting on your iron that's enough to activate the glue. If you use really, really hot iron, loads of steam, what you can end up doing there is sort of drawing the adhesive, sort of sucking it right out and into the fabric, and then it stops sticking. Right, let's make the basket. So this is so easy. All you're going to do is fold your square in half, and this is when using some wonder clips is a really good idea. Pins are great for fabric, But if you're doing anything within our form, then a few wonder clips are really worth having in your stash. So I'm just going to pin those 2 short edges. So I've got that done. So my next job is to sew down those short sides. And I'm going to use a generous 1/4 of an inch, okay? I'm just going to go very slightly over a 1/4 of an inch this time. Got quite a short stitch length as well, 1.8. And I'm using that really short stitch length because when you're sewing through lots of really thick, heavy layers, there is a tendency for seams to sort of pull open a little bit. And so a shorter stitch length is just much more secure, much tighter, and it's less likely to pop open. At the moment, it just looks like a little bit of a wallet. It doesn't look very basket shaped. So next thing I need to do is I'm going to grab my ruler. I've got a rotary ruler here, and I've also got a Sharpie marking pen, and I'm going to create the corners. So at the bottom, we've got a folded edge. That's the edge that we're interested in, okay? And I'm going to position my ruler, and I'm going to measure out a 1.5 inch square, and I'm going to draw it on using my Sharpie. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side, and then I always like to just kind of fold it in half and make sure that they're exactly the same, because you know it's Murphy's law that you'll do one 1.5 inches and the other one 1.25, or certainly I do. There's a siren, they're coming for me. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is now I've marked that square, I'm actually going to cut that square away. So I've got some really nice sharp scissors, and now what I'm going to do is open out my basket and fold that square down. So it's gone from this to this. So I'm just flattening it out. Again, just a generous 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now, when you get to the seams where you've got quite a lot of bosal all in one place, I'm just going to open that seam up using my fingers, and it just distributes the bulk. And I'm going to sew straight across. Exactly the same now on the other side. So we're going from that to that. So now, I mean, effectively I've boxed the corners. I can turn the whole thing through to the right side, and I'm going to just push those corners out, crease it the way I want it to go. And there you can see we've now got our basket shape. So we've now got a nice base and sides, and we're starting to get that basket shape, okay? So outer basket, more or less done. So I'll pop that to one side. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing with my lining fabric. So I've got my lovely polka dot, fabric, pins, bosal, clips. Now I used a generous 1/4 of an inch. For my lining, I want to go even slightly bigger than that. So I'm going to use about a good 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. The reason for that is when you're lining a bag or a basket, the internal dimensions are slightly smaller than the external dimensions. So you want your lining to be very slightly smaller so it's a nice snug fit. So if you just make all your seam allowances just ever so slightly bigger on your lining, you'll always have a nice snug lining. And now I'm going to do the same again as before. I'm going to create those little corners. Now I've got the corners that I cut off, so I can actually use those as a template this time. Just lay them down on my fabric and draw around them, making sure not to draw on your quilt. Cut those squares out like that. And then same as you did before, open out, put your hand inside and just bring those edges together. It's a short run. I'm not even going to bother pinning that. And there's no real bulk here, so this time rather than trying to open that seam allowance up, I'm just going to push it one way. Same thing on the other side. So I've made my little lining. Now the one thing that I didn't do was to leave a gap in my lining. I'm going to fess up, I forgot. So if you ever forget to do that, all you need to do is open up a little bit of your seam allowance and take out a few of the stitches so that you've got an opening. So I've got a few inches opening down one side of my basket. Enough to get a couple of fingers through at least. Okay, so that's the lining of my bag, and I'm going to pop that over here. I haven't turned it through to the right side. I'm going to keep it wrong side out. Okay, so our next job then is to make the handles of our basket. So remember, I've already fused the outer fabric to the piece of Bosal in our form. And then I've got my lining piece right sides together. And we'll just put a couple of wonder clips just to hold those together. What I'm going to do, I really need an open-ended tube. So I really only need to sew the two long sides, but I hate turning straps through any other way than my way, which requires the short end, one short end to be sewn as well. So I would much rather add, an extra ½ an inch or ¼ of an inch on, or sew across the end, turn it through, and then cut that end off. If I really need an open-ended tube, I'll do that because it's just so much quicker and easier. So ¼ of an inch seam allowance. Let's just get sewing all the way down, and then I'm going to pivot, and then we're going to come up the other side. So I'm just going to leave one short edge open. And then again, trusty chopstick. Now what you need to do this time is you need to pull the lining fabric away, okay? But leave the main fabric, it's already fused. Push a little indentation in with your thumb, and then pop the chopstick into that indentation, and then just wiggle the whole thing onto the chopstick. As soon as you're on like that, you can take the chopstick out and you can push the corner out. And this is great if you want a closed end to your strap. You just leave it like that. And if you want an open end, once it's pressed and top stitched, you can just chop that closed end off. So I'll give that a little press, just so it's all nice and flat. Do exactly the same with the other handle as well. Just pull the lining forward a little bit and push an indentation, grab your chopstick, and then just wiggle the whole thing on. We'll push the corner out. And I just think that's so much quicker and easier than trying to struggle pulling an open-ended tube through to the right side. Right, last thing I need to do for my handles is to top stitch down the long edges. So I'm going to increase the stitch length to 3. I'm going to sew about ¼ of an inch in from the edge. It's one side and then the other. You could add more quilting here if you wanted to. And then I'm just going to snip off that closed end. The reason for snipping off the closed end is that you've got a little extra bulk in there and you don't want that inside your basket. So it's a good idea to get rid of it. Just clip about ¼ of an inch off. And then I'm going to do exactly the same with the other handle. Time to put my basket together. So I'm going to grab my outer basket, which remember is right side on the outside, and I'm going to position my handle. Now what I want is when I turn this through, I want the rose fabric to be on the outside. So I need to make sure that the rose fabric is against the rose fabric, so right side to right side. And what I'll do is I'll position the first part, the raw edge of that strap, to the left of the seam allowance on the basket. So I've positioned it here, so it's right next to that seam, and clipped it in place. What I'm then going to do is bring this edge up so that it's the other side of that seam and clip that in place as well. And I think it's easiest if you do these one at a time, because what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just take the accessory box off my machine. Just makes it a little bit easier to get everything under the machine. And I'm just going to machine baste that handle in place. So I'll take my clips off. You could hand sew these handles on, just so that we can get rid of the clips before we try putting the whole bag together. It's all a little bit sort of bulky at the moment underneath the sewing machine. But the great thing with In Our Form is that you can just manipulate it and sort of pull it out of the way, squish it down, whatever you need to do to get it under the machine. And it's the same if you're making really big bags as well. There we go. So that handle now is just basted in place across the top. And then I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. So rows to rows in clip. And then the same on the other side. and clip that in place. And then we'll just baste them on using the sewing machine. So they're on. So now I just need to put the whole thing together. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I've got my lining and that's wrong side out. And I'm going to put my basket into the lining. Make sure you tuck the handles in. Now this can feel like a little bit of a squish because there feels like an awful lot more going into the lining. Trust me on this one, it will be fine. It will all work. And then you're going to start clipping the whole thing together using your wonder clips. Start with your two seams, your two main seams. So clip either side. And as soon as you've got those clipped into place, it kind of all starts to come together really, and you start to see what you're doing. And then we're just going to clip all the way around that top edge. So you're lining up the raw edge of your lining with the raw edge of the outer and the bosal, getting all of those edges together. Make sure you're keeping everything smooth, no pleats or tucks. And also just keep an eye out for particularly the outer fabric sort of creeping downwards, which can happen. So that's the top edge of my basket all clipped together. So now what I need to do is sew all the way around that top edge. So that's what I'm going to do next. Now this again is where having the free arm on your sewing machine exposed is really helpful, because it's going to allow you to slide the basket on, but you do want to take it nice and steady, nice and slow here. So a nice short stitch length, 1.8 again. And because you're sewing around a basket that's got kind of corners, it is going to catch. So be aware of that and make sure you stop regularly and move your basket around. So I've sewn now all the way around the top edge. I just need to find that opening. There it is. It's only a small one. So you just want to feel in with your fingers. That's why even on the smallest thing, you really need to be able to get at least 2 fingers in. Oh, hello. Just so that you can grab hold of that first little bit of fabric and start to pull it through. And the lining's the easiest bit to pull through. So start with that and start pulling that lining through the gap. I think it's a boy. There we go. Done it. I have got that little opening in my lining, which I need to stitch closed. So I'm just going to do that by machine. So I'll tuck those edges down. You could also do this by hand if you prefer. Use a matching thread. Okay, that's nice and secure. And then you're just going to tuck all of that lining inside your basket. And there we go. I finished my little basket. It didn't take long. That would be so lovely with some little gifts inside it. Maybe either some fat quarters or some fruit or, you know, anything lovely. Chocolates, handmade chocolates would be lovely. Very giftable, really practical as well. Great for taking your fabrics or storing your fabrics on the shelf. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial from Stuart Hillard Makes for my fabric basket, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, add some comments, and of course show pictures of your makes too. Happy sewing, happy making, and until next time, goodbye.